All right, welcome everybody, Breakwater Mega Church. We are going to continue our awesome series on the anchor of church history as it relates to the origin of Matthew's Gospel. Let's see what this does. That works. That worked great. So we call it the anarchy and the anchor right now in our day and age because of the changes that occurred in biblical research after the Enlightenment, and scholars began to take a naturalistic approach to Scripture and really an antichrist approach, in my opinion. So nowadays, commentaries neglect the formidable chain. And so we looked at this one commentary just to highlight the situation, Jameson Fawcett Brown commentary. And so I color coded, what's good, bad, and made my comments in yellow. So if I republish this, and we'll have it, if I can get this to move, will it work? That's no bueno. All right, let's go like this, see if that's going to do anything. Am I frozen? It's sharing a window. Stop sharing. Hide my window. Let's hide that. Why won't this work for me? Does anybody know?
I don't know.
Where's Chris when we need him?
It looks like there's a play arrow on the left side, but I don't know if that does anything.
I don't know what this is doing. All right, so how do I get anything back? What's this? Oops. What's this one? Okay, okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll see if this is going to work, okay? All right, so there is, according to all manner of history, a formidable number of scholars, critics, that Matthew's Gospel was written in Hebrew, also known as Aramaic or Syro-Chaldaic. All right, those three very similar languages, and they're synonymous with the native tongue of Jesus. Okay, and so the Greek Matthew is a translation. That's history. They don't know who did it, either the evangelist himself or some unknown person. Who cares? It's a good job. So we looked at the different evidences of formidable change. We looked at Papias, which says that Matthew drew up the gospel in Hebrew dialect, and everyone interpreted them or translated them as he was able. Irenaeus, we looked at him last week. Pontanus, who was the headmaster of the school in Alexandria, went on a mission trip to India, came back with the Gospel of Matthew. So here's an eminent scholar, thought it was such a treasure to actually bring it back with him. And the question was, is he going to take their only copy of Matthew's Gospel, or are they going to make a copy of it and bring it back? It's not that difficult to copy it and make a new copy. He's going to leave them with their original copy and bring one back himself. And he's going to put that in the library at Alexandria, which where it should be. We'll get rid of that door. Okay. All right, moving on. Got my Breakwater shirt on. Can you see that? Yeah, I feel good. And we looked at the fact that the word is that Bartholomew took that gospel with him on his first missionary journey, which means it had to be created, composed, and published before the initial evangelism phase of apostolic missionary activity. If Bartholomew took it on his first missionary journey, it had to be written before he went, so that he had this as the teaching manual or as the exemplar that he could take with him to use for preaching text, which means he preached from that. Now the question is, do you imagine that Bartholomew got lucky, pulled the right straw, he's got the only copy of Matthew's Gospel? They're going to make hundreds of them. Like we said, on the Dead Sea Scrolls, they have multiple copies of Isaiah, multiple copies of Deuteronomy, this one little scriptorium out in the Dead Sea. The small little community has thousands and thousands and thousands of documents that they found out there, just in one place. Every synagogue was a library. Scribes, what do you think they did all day? They make things. The Ethiopian eunuch came into Jerusalem, took home with him the Isaiah scroll. Could you imagine that he could come into town, buy an Isaiah scroll, and take it back to Ethiopia with him? Jesus could go up to Nazareth, and they gave him the Isaiah scroll that he read. Remember Isaiah 61, 1 and 2. So the point is that the mass production of biblical materials was common in those days, especially among the Jewish people. So how is it possible or even thinkable that the apostles who just watched Jesus being raised from the dead couldn't find any ink or parchment to write one small story about Jesus? The whole premise is flawed from the get-go. So we looked at Jerome a couple of times, actually, because I got that new commentary, and there's some new material in there that was really important, because Jerome said he went to the library in Caesarea where they kept the Aramaic Gospel of Matthew, and he translated it into Greek, which I read to you last week from his commentary on Matthew, which is to say how effortlessly was that for Jerome, and Greek is a second language for him. He's a learned language. It's not his mother tongue. To find the Aramaic Matthew, determine that it was not a false gospel, which he could easily do, and then translate it into Greek. Wouldn't you love to have both of those? Wouldn't it be awesome if we could have Jerome's Greek translation of Matthew's gospel? So what do you do with this kind of information in the modern period, which has completely turned all of this on its head? You have to say that Jerome is out of his mind. Jerome doesn't know what he's talking about. Pantaenus doesn't know anything. Papias, what does he know? Papias is in contact with people who knew the apostles, who bring him information as they're coming through Hierapolis, which is modern day Turkey. So here's a guy that gets reputable apostolic tradition. He's just passing it on. He's not inventing it. He's not making it up. He's going, I think I got an idea here in Revelation. He's getting it from people who give it to him. And then the tradition about this is spread throughout the world. So we looked at Jerome, who's from Rome. He's been in Palestine. He's been in Alexandria. Jerome's been all over. And today we want to look at Origen. So Origen, like everyone else, said that the first gospel is written by Matthew in Hebrew. All right, so this is what we know. We haven't got to Eusebius yet. We may not even get to him. But he says pretty much the same thing that has been coming down, because he's reporting on that Epiphanius. We're not going to deal with at this moment today. But now we get to the red part in the commentary, which is going to deal with Origen. So Origen just said, I have a tradition that says the authentic Gospel of Matthew was written in Aramaic for the Jews, okay? And so what these guys then have to do is undermine all of that. So Origen is suspicious, okay? And this report only comes to us from Eusebius. Origen did not say it's a fact of his investigations. Well, what else would it be, right? He doesn't have to investigate anything. He knows the tradition. He knows where it comes from. He learned it by tradition, as if that tradition is wrong simply because you use the word tradition. You hear what I'm saying? He learned it by tradition. Oh, that's bad. It has a negative connotation to it when it should actually have a positive connotation, because this is apostolic tradition of everything that's Christian has been passed down to us. We're supposed to contend for faith as it was delivered to the apostles. So if we have tradition that's been faithfully passed down from disciple to disciple to disciple, you want that tradition. And so simply because it's a tradition that Papias spoke from many voices, not just himself, but many people, every single person actually who passed this information on to him is absolutely sure and solid that it was written by the first gospel written by Matthew for the Hebrew people in their own language. So he says it's surprising that he even believed that tradition. It's not even said that he believed it. Okay, keep that in mind because that's a lie. Are you with me? That is a twisting of everything that's true that Origen has to say. And we're going to look exactly what Origen said. Who is this guy? What does he say? Now, I want you to see what happens in our commentaries. Okay? So let's say that I'm a Bible student and I don't have access to any primary sources and I'm going to trust these guys because they're trustworthy, supposedly. And I read this. What do I come away with after reading this? Papias is wrong. Irenaeus is misguided. Jerome doesn't know what he's talking about. Epiphanius is just picking up, this hearsay. And Origen, this is just so much suspicion about this. It's all just this tradition. This tradition is just crazy. He doesn't even believe it. And then Origen speaks of the Greek as if it were the only original. We don't have every single thing that Origen ever wrote to determine whether or not that's an accurate statement. But Origen does speak Greek, and the Gospel of Matthew comes to us very early in the Greek, probably simultaneously translated for both languages in the known world. Why wouldn't you? Like we already saw last week when we looked at Jerome in the last session, that Jerome has access to the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew in the library of Caesarea, and he translated into Greek. How hard was that? For a professional scholar like him? Yeah. Oh, look at this. I'm going to translate into Greek. Yeah, just did it like that. Not hard. So it's not like, oh, wow, we got to find somebody who speaks Greek and Aramaic, and then they got to make parchment. They got to kill a goat, and it's going to be so hard. It's so hard. Oh, my gosh. Origen made 6,000 volumes. And Jerome could translate the entire Old Testament from the Hebrew into Latin. Who are these people? Okay? These aren't some German scholars, okay? So this is misinformation right here, okay? And in several places, it's true, he refers to the Gospel of Hebrews as a work known to be in existence. Well, I should make that green because that's true, right? And he doesn't say it doesn't have any authority. Are you kidding me? He doesn't speak Aramaic. He's not really good at that. And so why should he even bother with the Aramaic Gospel? You know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm not going to preach in Spanish. And, I could. Actually have preached in Spanish before. And I have done Spanish sermons before. But I'm going to do it in English for an English audience because that's who my people are. I'm not going to go out of my way to go, in the Spanish Bible, it says this for an English-speaking audience. Okay? Does it mean that the Spanish-speaking Bible doesn't have authority? It would if I'm speaking Spanish to Spanish-speaking people from a Spanish translation. It will have all the authority in the world. So the way that they go about this thing, it just is unbelievable to me. And then it goes, this is enough to throw doubt over the whole tradition. Can you imagine? This is enough. That's all I need. All this talk about this gospel and the origination of it, and all this formidable chain of all the major scholars and that's ever existed and come down to us. I doubt that. Yeah. No, it's no good. No good. All right. So then even the Pantena story looked at, he goes, oh, it's just mythical. And they're just echoing. Jerome just echoes Eusebius. Jerome doesn't know what he's talking about, on and on and on. So we've been looking at the various chain and what Jerome has said. You can go back and look it up in previous sessions. We had really good stuff from him. And I added an addendum. And now we worked through, look at all this. We worked through all this. We got through the fact that in Jerome's material, Jerome was personally able to access and examine Origen's hexapla. And I'm going to talk to you about that. Okay? So this hexapla was in the library in Caesarea. Okay? We're familiar with that library. 30,000 volumes. It's a scholar library. It's a Christian library. Okay? 30,000 volumes. One of those volumes was Matthew's Gospel in Aramaic, used by the Syrian-speaking churches. Okay? We saw that over and over again. And they also had something in there from Origen, which we will look at. All right? So let's get right to that. I could go back over this again just because I love it so much and I want to read it. But let's find out. We talked about Irenaeus. He's in France. He agrees with the tradition. He was also in our last session. The Gospel according to Matthew, written for the Jews. Of course it was. What else it would be? He goes on and on about it. Where are we? Oh, here we go. So Origen, born in Alexandria, to Christian parents. So he's Greek-speaking Roman. His father was martyred in the persecutions of 202. So in the reign of terror of Nero, there began persecutions of Christians that raged in various periods up until Constantine put an end to it in 311. Okay? So in this series of persecutions, Origen's father was put to death. And he wanted to die with his dad. He's a teenager, but his mother hid his clothes, so he couldn't go outside and be put to death. But he was a genius. He was appointed to the headmaster of the school in Alexandria. Okay, so Pontanus was the headmaster of that school, and then Clement, after him, was the headmaster, and then Origen. And Origen served for 20 years as headmaster of the Christian school in Alexandria. Later, he moved to Caesarea, which is where the library is, where he's ordained a priest, and he founded a school there. And a part of the rationale for the school was to bring people in, young people from Greek philosophies, and to teach them Christian principles as the best form of truth and as a competitor to Greek philosophy. Okay? So he managed to convert a very wealthy patron who he was able to hire 7 shorthand writers. And he just cranked out stuff day and night. He's reputed to have written 6,000 volumes. Not all of it has survived just because of the ravages of war and time and all kinds of things that have taken place. We're lucky to have anything from 2,000 years ago, you know what I'm saying? So his greatest achievement in textual criticism was this thing called the hexapla. It's a synopsis of 6 versions of the Hebrew scripture. So here's the 6 things, okay? And this is the Old Testament, all right? So he has the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. He transliterated every word into Greek letters. You understand what that is? Yeah, so we do it all the time when I show you on overhead. Here's the Greek words, but here's what it would be if you wrote them in English letters and then you could read it. You see, phobia. Well, you can't read it if it's in Greek letters. So he took every word in the Hebrew text, transliterated it into Greek. And then he has 4 other versions of the Old Testament that he put side by side. So the Aquila version was a word-for-word literal version of the Septuagint, the LXX, the 70, right? So even in our modern era, we have multiple English translations, and some are more what they call wooden than others, and some are dynamic. Some are word-for-word literal translations, Young's literal translation. So it even keeps the pattern of the old language, okay? And then you have the more polished literary Greek, and then you have the Septuagint itself. And then you have Theodotion, some Old Testament books, but not in Psalms or Minor Prophets. So he created this 6-column Old Testament, a word-for-word comparison of the Hebrew Scriptures with 5 other Greek translations. And he worked on this for 20 years. Okay, how smart is this guy? What does he know about anything? Okay, the estimated length of this, because a certain amount of this has survived. And so they're able to extrapolate from what we have to what he said he did, it's 6,500 pages. Okay, so in the library, I don't know if he's probably gonna have volumes. You can't have a 6,000 page Bible. But can you imagine? And it was kept at the Great Library in Caesarea. And this was used by Jerome and Eusebius, okay? And used by other scholars who come in, wanted it. Now, unfortunately, that entire library was destroyed in the Arab conquest in the 7th century. So when the Arabs went around conquering the world, burning libraries. So after his tenure there, in the wars and in the Roman persecutions, he was imprisoned, chained, tortured constantly during the persecutions of Roman Emperor Decius in 250. So their intent was not to kill him, but to torture him into denying Christ. So when Decius died, he was released from prison and died 3 years later, age 69, from injuries. Philip Schaff, noted historian, said Origen was the greatest scholar of his age and the most gifted, most industrious, and most cultivated of all the ante-Nicene fathers. That means prior to Nicaea 325. Okay, so all the guys added up together before this particular time, he's the top guy, all right? So he's not some first-year Bible student. He's the head of the school, head of 2 schools, top textual critic, and commentaries, 6,000. Some of his commentaries we still have. So in his commentary, the part that exists on Matthew, he says this, and here's what we want to read from him. He says, concerning the 4 Gospels, which are alone are uncontroverted in the Church of God in heaven. In other words, everyone agrees that there's 4 Gospels and what those 4 Gospels are. I accept the traditional view of the 4 Gospels, which alone are undeniably authentic in the Church of God on earth. Okay? Does this sound like a guy that's unsure? Does it sound like a guy that doesn't know anything? Does it sound like a guy who's, hoping that Papias is right? No. First to be written was the Apostle Matthew, published for believers of Jewish origin, composed in Aramaic. Mark followed Peter, Luke, who's praised by Paul, and last of all, John. Okay? So Origen is correct about the origin of Mark. Most people agree that that's accurate. And Luke, a longtime friend of Paul's, and John. So why would he not be right about Matthew? Okay? What we want to note here is that Origen doesn't know of any loose collection, right, of Old Testament sayings. He doesn't know of a Q document. He doesn't know of a proto document. He doesn't know of an Gospel compiled by Matthew in Aramaic. The only thing compiled by Matthew in Aramaic has always and only been the Gospel. Now, all of this other conversation about the loose collection of Old Testament sayings, Q document, proto-gospel, that's all a result of the modern critical movement since the Enlightenment period. And we're fixated on that in all of our commentaries. There's never any discussion anywhere that this Aramaic gospel was less than or inferior to the Greek gospel. Of all the people that we've looked at and all the people that we've reviewed, no one says the Aramaic Gospel is less than the Greek Gospel. The Greek Gospel is better or more authoritative than the Hebrew Gospel. Okay? The Gospel is the Gospel. Now, Origen has access to the greatest Christian libraries at the time, the ones in Alexandria and the ones in Caesarea in Palestine. And he is a highly respected voice concerning the textual quality of biblical manuscripts. What do you say? So when you think about his interaction with manuscripts and his access to the availability of manuscripts at the time, he had access to the broadest range of manuscripts possible in the world, this guy. So he's not dealing with fragments. He's not dealing with little pieces. I got a little P1 and a little P2 and P150, you know. He's got full-on biblical manuscripts. He's got access to Hebrew manuscripts. He's got 4 or 5 different Old Testament Greek manuscripts. He's got who's got more access to manuscripts than him? Full-on ones, right? So he knows more about biblical text than anyone living today. What would you say about that? Okay. Does he know more than anybody living today? Easily. So what he says about Matthew's gospel should carry much more weight than somebody removed 1,700 years from the manuscripts that he holds in his hands. And then tortured for Christ. Would any of these people be tortured for Christ? I doubt it. So this history that, I doubt it. I doubt this tradition. Who are you? It's so firmly anchored in apostolic fact that he was imprisoned and tortured and died for his faith in the biblical Jesus as portrayed in Matthew's gospel. Are you with me? So what has Ramirez done for you lately? Lockman, Boltman, DeBalia, Schleiermacher, Schweitzer. What have they done for you? What have they done for anybody? Nothing. More to be said about Origen, but that's enough to show you that when he says, I accept this tradition, that he's not some blind man in the corner, just wishful thinking. All in favor?
Yes.
Okay, let's rifle through these guys. Augustine, 354, 400. He's at the end of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th, okay? He's as far as we need to go in this particular event. But he's a very famous guy. He's one of the 4 great architects of the Latin Church. Okay, when they think about the growing movement towards the Romanism, the Roman Church, he's one of the 4 cornerstones of that organization. Okay? Well respected by a lot of people. So he confirms that Matthew wrote the first gospel in this harmony of the gospels. These 4 evangelists whose names have gained the most remarkable circulation over the whole world. First, Matthew. Mark, Luke, John. Of these 4, it's true, only Matthew is reckoned to have written in the Hebrew language, the others in Greek. Okay? And concerning Mark's gospel, I thought this was really interesting. First of all, do you see that? Pretty clear. He says that Mark follows Matthew closely and looks like his intended and epitomizer, which is summarizing. So in his narrative, who's he talking about? He's talking about Mark, right? In Mark's narrative, he gives nothing in concert with John. He has little to record, okay? So in terms of comparing Mark with John, there's very little, right? And in conjunction with Luke, he has still less. I mean, there's some commonality with Luke, some there, but not much. Okay? But in concord with Matthew, which means that in harmony with Matthew, he has what? A very large number of passages. So John, not much, Luke, some, but Matthew, tons. Which is to say that Augustine has viewed all four of these, put them side by side, read them through, and can clearly see that Mark and Matthew are very close in wording. He says almost numerically and identically the same. Okay? The words. It's pretty amazing, huh? So his hypothesis is that Matthew's written first, and that the Gospel of Mark used Matthew and Peter as sources. So this is a two-source theory. It seems kind of hard to imagine that Matthew and Mark could be so close unless they did have some literary connection, right? Which, in my opinion, Peter had Matthew's Gospel to preach from when he went on his mission journeys. Bartholomew is not going to be the only one with that. And the reason that Mark is able to replicate Peter's preaching and it ends up being so close to Matthew is consistent with the solid tradition of the content of the gospel. They're not fabricating, making new stuff and, adding and putting in all kinds of things. And Mark, rather than add anything and make up anything, he tried to be as faithful as he possibly could to Peter's preaching as it is in Matthew's gospel. All right? So he says the Gospel of Luke was written using both Mark and Matthew. That's a scholarly opinion. Could very well be, but if he's using Mark and Mark is 90% Matthew, you know what I'm saying? In other words, Mark is 661 verses. 601 verses are Matthew, almost identical. So if Luke uses Mark, it's the same as using Matthew. Does that make sense? And Luke and Mark are together in Rome when Luke writes his gospel in the Acts of the Apostles in defense of Paul before the Roman tribunal, which he was 2 years imprisonment there. Mark is with him. Luke is with him. So if Mark had written a previous gospel, there'd be no reason in the world why Luke shouldn't use that, because Luke says, I'm investigating from eyewitnesses. This is from Peter, which is 90% Matthew. He's only got 60 unique verses for himself, which means all of Mark can be found in Matthew and Luke except for 60 verses. All right? Not a bad idea. Chrysostom was the Pope of Constantinople, okay? 344, 407, 4th and 5th century, straddling it right there. He says Matthew, from among the Jews, composed his gospel in the language of the Hebrews. So now this is in Constantinople. So we've seen it in Alexandria, we've seen it in Caesarea, we've seen it in France, we've seen it all over the world. This is the common tradition. All right? And I found this, I was really happy to find Sophronius, who affirms that Matthew wrote within 8 years of the ascension. Okay, so Sophronius is the patriarch, which we would probably call it the Pope, pretty much, or the bishop, the head bishop of this district of Jerusalem. And he's 7th century. He confirms the testimony of Jerome that there's a Hebrew gospel in Caesarea. Okay? So Jerome, late 4th, early 5th. Okay? Sophronius certifies that Jerome was able to make a copy of that Aramaic Gospel. All right? Jerome says he did. Yeah. Who are we to say he didn't? I doubt it. That's got a mythological air. I don't think so. I'm smart. I got a PhD. So Sophronius affirms that Matthew wrote within 8 years of the ascension. which I think is even too late. And I don't think it takes 8 years to do that. It took 2 years for Josephus to write the entire history of the Wars of the Jews. The war's over in 73. He published that in Aramaic within 2 years, the entire history of the fall of Jerusalem and the conquest of the Jews, the eviction of the Jews, and then translated into Greek because he wanted people on the western side of the empire to happen. So he says, I published this in our own tongue, Aramaic, and I sent it to everybody to Levant, to the Mesopotamian, to Syria, in the Aramaic-speaking world, and then I had it translated perfectly, seamlessly, effortlessly. They had people who look at the Greek translation go, it looks like an original copy. Wow. To the Greek speaking. And as I said before, Greek has been around a long time, Aramaic has been around a long time. Both these cultures have been combined for a long time. There's probably not one word in Aramaic that doesn't already have a corresponding word in Greek. There's nothing in Greek that doesn't have a corresponding word in Aramaic. It's like Spanish and English, Just because you translate something from Spanish into English doesn't mean you're going to use the Spanish sentence structure. You're going to translate property into proper English. And you're going to go, oh, that looks like seamlessly into English. Of course, that's what you're supposed to do. That's what good translators do, right? So he quotes Jerome, as we know, if you've been with me, you've been paying attention to this. And then he's going to add his own comments, okay? And his own comments are important to us. So first he's going to quote what we learned from Jerome, and that's that Matthew, he's the apostle, he first to compose the gospel, right, of Christ in the Hebrew language. Okay? We know that. And it was later translated into Greek. So he says, he agrees that the Hebrew text is preserved to this day in the library. Okay? Now this is much later than Jerome. Okay, Jerome's 400s, straddles the 400s. And the Syrians use it. Who are Syrians? They're Aramaic-speaking people in this Aramaic-speaking city. And he copied it. Not only did he copy it, but he translated it, right? And then we saw that Jerome was astute enough to realize that when the Syrian version, the Aramaic version, quotes the Old Testament, it's the Hebrew text. Okay? You would expect that. Why wouldn't I expect that? Okay? Mm-hmm. So now here's where Sophronius pipes up his own. So he goes, okay, so Matthew wrote first for Jews 8 years after his ascension. Okay? So again, that's definitely earlier than most modern scholars will give it. Some say John translated it. Why not? Stephen could have done it. Philip could have done it. There's a tremendous amount of Greek-speaking Jews in the day and age. Jerome could have done it, right? But what I want to see here is this particular note about 8 years, which is say very early, and I just wouldn't even put it that long. So the Hebrew language Gospel of Matthew is still in the library in the 7th century. It is the exemplar, the Vorlage. That's a new word I learned. Translated into the Greek Gospel of Matthew. This is the formidable chain. It's the universal testimony from every reliable source. Every reliable source. This is the chain of evidence, okay? It's an unbreakable chain, in my opinion. And it is the history of both of these. I mean, there's less known about the Greek translation than is about the Hebrew, right? We don't know who did it. Mm-hmm. But we know who did this. Oh, I doubt that. Yeah. I doubt Matthew did it. But we have more information on who wrote the Aramaic than we do about the Greek, but they care more about the Greek than they do the Aramaic. It's twisted. So the evidence is important, ladies and gentlemen. is abundant and it was unchallenged, even by the wide range of heretics, which is to say, even the heretics used Matthew's gospel as an authority, okay? Until now, until the modern period, until historical critical method priority of Matthew is now challenged, right? Unbelievable. So, we looked at this before, just briefly, the fact that the Aramaic Gospel of Matthew has been continually used in the Eastern churches, in the Levant, in the Mesopotamia, Syria, Iraq, and all that area over there, to this all the way to India, to this very day, it's still used in Malabar. Okay? The Aramaic Gospel is still used. The scriptures in the Church of the East, from the very beginning of Christianity to this present day, in Aramaic. Lamza. So the Eastern Church, which is that side, the people that Josephus wrote the wars originally to and sent, okay, to Babylon, to Mesopotamia, to Syria, to all that area over there, Persia. They say that we receive the scriptures from the hands of the apostles themselves in the Aramaic original, the language spoken by our Lord Jesus Christ himself. All right? When these guys look at the scripture, they say, when we look at the Lord's Prayer, these are the very words of Jesus Christ. This is the prayer as he said it. There's no confusion in the historical record. Matthew's oracles, complete Gospel of Matthew, written in Aramaic, translated into Greek, and many other languages as we looked at. Plenty of languages. Okay? However, now the view popularized even among conservative scholars in the West. Mark wrote first, 30 years after the resurrection of Christ, and that Matthew and Luke use Mark's gospel as their pattern. Except if you accept this view, Matthew didn't write his gospel. Why do you still call it Matthew's gospel if you accept this view? Matthew's dead by the time this happens, by the time his gospel, according to the new view, is written. Okay? If it's written in 80 AD up to 110 AD, how's it Matthew's gospel? Oh, because Matthew wrote the Q, Matthew collated the Old Testament, Matthew had a little something to say in it, so it's got his little footprint on it. We're gonna use Matthew's name for authority. Isn't that pseudepigrapha? Isn't that fake? Isn't that a lie? So if you're going to accept Mark in priority or Mark first and Matthew 80, just stop calling it Matthew's gospel. Call it the unknown gospel.
Yeah.
Because they say they're unknown authors. We don't know who wrote it. Somewhere between 85 and 110, you know. And so in order for the Mark first view to prevail, all history has to be abused, twisted, ignored, and the Gospel of Matthew's got to be minimized, redefined. I doubt it. It's myth. So the Logia, the complete Gospel of Matthew, clearly historic record. The Western view, the new view, it's not even Western. Yeah, I guess Western view. The Western view of the late Origen of Matthew and the use of Mark as a literary source by an unknown author is 100% false.
Yeah.
It's 100% false.
Mm-hmm.
Picture Jerome turning in his grave right now. He goes, what about me? It's in the library at Caesarea. Yeah. All the Syrian-speaking churches use them. And so the entire Eastern Syriac church, they go, no, we've had it from forever. No, you didn't. Well, we did. We still use it. No, I doubt it. I doubt that you had that. You don't have any proof of that. Yeah, we do. We have our own history in our churches, and we have development. We have scriptures. Okay? But I'm saying that Mark in priority is false, but it's also damaging to the New Testament. because what it does is devalue the revelation of Christ. So that you're not actually even talking about Christ anymore. You're talking about redaction criticism, form criticism, source criticism, textual criticism, and on and on and on. Q, and what Jesus said, and what Jesus didn't say, and this is Matthew. Matthew made a mistake here, and Matthew put that in there, and Matthew didn't know what he was talking about. It's like unbelievable. So for me, in my house, no reason to accept this novelty. It's a novel virus.
It is a virus, yeah.
Invented. It was invented by those who reject Christ as Savior,
Yeah.
Christ and Lord. True or false? Okay. It was invented by those who have no allegiance to Jesus Christ. And as far as I'm concerned, there's no reason to reject the universal and orthodox tradition of the Christian fathers. There's no reason whatsoever to do that. All right? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming today. Any questions about any of this? And this isn't even all. There's more information available now to us, but this should be enough to show that this was universal, unanimously held by the top textual critics, by the top scholars, by the top Christian leadership in every part of the Christian empire, from Spain to India. All right? And so in order to reject that, you have to bend over real far. And all is it done is wreak havoc on the scriptures. Okay? Let's go here. I'm hoping this was the
Was there
right
somebody
one.
earlier than Origen? Like
Mhm.
did they?
Yeah, definitely.
Huh?